The house had been silent for months. So silent that even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway felt like thunder to his ears. Silence had become his enemy. Silence reminded him of all that was missing, of the life that had slipped away. But that evening, as Richard stepped through the front door of his grand but empty mansion, something unusual pierced the silence. It was faint at first, like the distant ringing of bells, but then it grew clearer, brighter, unmistakable. It was laughter, pure, unrestrained laughter echoing from upstairs. He froze. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. After all, this was the same house where his daughter, Emily, had spent years trapped in her wheelchair, her illness stealing the joy from her life. Since her mother's passing, Emily hadn't laughed, not once. Richard had tried everything, doctors, therapies, tutors, toys. But all he saw in her eyes was quiet sadness. He had accepted that joy was something forever out of her reach. But tonight, that sound, laughter, her laughter, flowed down the staircase like music. Richard's heart pounded as he climbed the steps, one at a time, careful not to break the fragile spell. His life as a successful businessman had taught him to prepare for the worst, but nothing could prepare him for what he found when he reached Emily's bedroom door. The door was half open, and he peeked inside. Emily was sitting in her wheelchair, her frail body leaning forward, her face glowing. Across from her, twirling clumsily yet joyfully, was Maria, the maid Richard had hired only months ago. She was holding Emily's hands, helping her clap to the rhythm of a song. The two of them were giggling, swaying, almost dancing. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was beautiful. It was life. Richard's throat tightened. For years, he had believed money could solve everything. He had hired experts, therapists, and specialists. But none of them gave Emily what she truly needed. Someone who saw her not as a patient, but as a child deserving of love, fun, and laughter. Maria wasn't trained, she wasn't highly educated, but she had something that couldn't be bought. Kindness. He leaned against the doorframe, unable to stop the tears from falling. Emily hadn't even noticed him yet. She was too busy laughing, too busy living in that rare moment of joy. For Richard, it was both a revelation and a rebuke. He realized how blind he had been, pouring his energy into building an empire while his daughter's spirit quietly withered. And yet, here was Maria, someone he had overlooked, someone he had hired for ordinary work, breathing life back into Emily's world. The following days changed everything. Richard began spending less time at the office and more time at home. It wasn't easy. Stepping away from the business he had built with his own hands felt like abandoning a part of himself. But when he saw Emily's face light up every time Maria entered the room, he knew what truly mattered. He joined their little games, awkward at first, but slowly learning how to let go of the weight he carried. Still, challenges remained. Emily's health was fragile, and some days her illness left her too weak to move. On those days, frustration clouded her bright spirit, and Richard would feel helpless. Maria, however, never gave up. She encouraged Emily to sing when she couldn't dance, to paint when she couldn't play, to smile when she couldn't laugh. Bit by bit, Richard learned from Maria how to be present, how to be patient, and how to bring comfort instead of solutions. There were moments of setback, like when Emily's condition worsened after a long winter, or when Richard's business partners warned him that stepping back from work would ruin everything he had built. But Richard no longer cared for boardroom victories. His greatest victory was hearing his daughter's laughter again, even if only for a few fleeting minutes each day. One evening, as the three of them sat in Emily's room, she looked at her father with wide, shining eyes. "Daddy," she said softly, "you don't look sad anymore." Richard swallowed hard. That simple sentence was more valuable than any award, any bank balance, any recognition he had ever received. He glanced at Maria, who smiled knowingly, and he realized that life had given him a second chance. A chance to love, to nurture, to truly be a father. From that day on, Richard made a promise, no matter how much or how little time Emily had left, it would be filled with joy. He hired fewer people with degrees and more people with hearts. He turned his mansion into a home where love, laughter, and warmth echoed through every corner. And every time he heard Emily's laughter drift through the halls, Richard would close his eyes and whisper a quiet prayer of gratitude. For Maria, for his daughter, and for the moment upstairs that had changed his life forever. Because sometimes, it takes just one sound, one laugh, one spark, to remind us of what truly matters. And once you hear it, you can never go back to silence again. The house had always felt like a hollow monument to wealth, a place too big for the hearts that lived inside it. Every room was polished to perfection, every surface gleamed under the chandeliers, but none of it could mask the emptiness that echoed through the halls. Richard often told himself that silence was the price of order, the mark of a disciplined life, yet deep inside, he knew it was the sound of absence. His wife's laughter no longer drifted from the piano room, and his daughter's joy had been stolen by an illness that chained her to a wheelchair. For years, silence became the master of the house, a constant reminder that something precious had been lost and perhaps would never return. But then came that evening, when the silence broke in the most unexpected way. He had just returned home from another long day of meetings, his briefcase heavy in his hand, his thoughts heavier still. The air was thick with the same stillness he dreaded, but then he paused mid-step. A sound, faint at first, floated down from the upper floor. His mind sharpened, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the creak of wood or the hum of the heater. It was lighter, brighter, alive. His heart skipped as he realized what it was: laughter. The kind of laughter that wasn't polite or forced but free, bubbling, innocent. He froze where he stood, his breath caught in his throat. For months, maybe even years, he hadn't heard such a sound within these walls. He questioned himself, wondering if it was his imagination, a cruel trick his tired mind was playing on him. But then it came again, louder this time, carrying a rhythm that seemed to dance with the still air. His pulse quickened as though he were running, though his feet hadn't yet moved from the floor. Could it be his daughter? Could it be Emily? That thought struck him like lightning. Emily, who had once filled the house with joy before her illness took over, hadn't laughed in so long that Richard feared she had forgotten how. He remembered her quiet gaze, the way her small hands clutched the arms of her wheelchair, her smile always faint, always polite but never alive. He remembered the nights when he would try to make her laugh with silly stories, only to be met with silence or a soft nod that broke his heart. But now, unmistakably, there it was, the laughter of a child, rising and falling like music, spilling from upstairs and washing over him like the first rainfall after a drought. His chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Step by step, he began to climb the staircase, each creak of the wood under his shoes mingling with the sound that pulled him higher. He slowed his pace, afraid that rushing would make the moment vanish, like trying to hold on to smoke. The laughter grew clearer, and with it came another sound. A woman's voice, playful, encouraging, filled with warmth. He recognized it after a moment. It belonged to Maria, the maid he had hired not long ago, a young woman with kind eyes who kept mostly to her duties and spoke very little. But now her voice was animated, carrying a melody of joy he hadn't expected. Richard's hands trembled as he reached the landing, his heart pounding against his ribs, as though preparing him for something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The closer he came, the more vivid the sound became, until he was standing before Emily's door. It was slightly ajar, a thin line of golden light spilling into the dark hallway. His instincts told him to push it open, to rush inside, but another part of him hesitated, savoring the moment. He stood still, leaning against the frame, letting the sound wash over him. His eyes stung, and for the first time in years, tears threatened to fall, not from grief but from a tenderness that shook him to the core. He knew that whatever he was about to see would change him, and so he lingered, heart hammering, ears tuned to the laughter that had already begun to heal something deep within him. Richard pushed the door just enough to see inside, and what he witnessed rooted him to the spot. His daughter Emily was there, her fragile frame bent slightly forward in her wheelchair, her pale face lit up by a glow he hadn't seen in years. Her lips, usually pressed into a thin line, were stretched wide in laughter, her eyes sparkling with the innocence he thought her illness had stolen forever. Across from her was Maria, the maid he had hired only a few months back, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, her apron crumpled from hours of work. But at that moment, she wasn't sweeping floors or folding laundry. She was holding Emily's small hands and twirling them back and forth as if they were dancing. The scene was so simple, yet so extraordinary, that Richard felt his knees weaken. Maria wasn't graceful in her movements. She stumbled a little, exaggerated her steps comically, and made funny faces as if she were performing on a grand stage. Emily responded with giggles that burst from her chest like bubbles rising to the surface of water, uncontrolled and unstoppable. Her laughter rang through the room, bouncing off the walls, filling the space with warmth that seemed to push back every shadow. It wasn't a moment of therapy. It wasn't a medical session. It wasn't planned or forced. It was pure, unfiltered joy born from connection. Richard found himself frozen at the door, torn between stepping in and letting them continue without interruption. For years, He had hired professionals who came armed with charts, exercises, and schedules, yet none of them had ever managed to awaken the light that now blazed in his daughter's face. They treated Emily like a project, a puzzle to be solved, but Maria saw her as a little girl who wanted to laugh, to feel alive, to be seen beyond her illness. Richard had never considered that something so small, so human, could spark such transformation. As he stood watching, a rush of memories overcame him. He remembered the nights when Emily was younger, before her illness grew worse, when he would come home late from work and find her waiting with crayons in her hands, eager to show him her drawings. She would laugh then, too, a sound that filled him with pride. But as her condition worsened, her drawings stopped, her playfulness faded, and her laughter vanished completely. The house became quieter with every passing month, and Richard, unable to fix what was broken, buried himself in work to escape the soundless weight pressing on his chest. He thought he was doing what was best, but as he watched Maria twirl clumsily in front of Emily, he realized how much he had missed, how much his daughter still longed for the simple joys he had assumed were lost forever. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. He didn't want to look away, didn't want to miss even a second of the miracle unfolding before him. Emily's laughter was like a forgotten song suddenly remembered, each note striking chords deep within him. It was as if her spirit had been sleeping, waiting for someone to whisper to it gently enough to wake it up. Maria was that whisper, and the awakening was more powerful than any medicine, more healing than any therapy money could buy. Emily clapped her hands together, her voice trembling with delight. "Again, Maria! Again!" she begged, her words spilling out in excitement. Maria grinned, her face flushed from moving, and nodded eagerly. "Of course, my little star, as many times as you want," she said before twirling again, making a silly bow that sent Emily into another fit of laughter. Richard pressed his hand to his chest, overwhelmed by the realization that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the one thing he thought he could never get back. And it hadn't come from doctors or specialists, but from the unassuming kindness of a young woman who treated his daughter not as a burden, but as a child who still deserved joy. Richard's breath hitched as he stepped back from the doorway, his heart heavy yet light all at once. The sound of their laughter continued behind him, spilling out into the hallway, chasing away the silence that had haunted the house for so long. Every giggle, every squeal of delight etched itself into his memory, a reminder of what truly mattered, a reminder that somewhere between wealth and responsibility, he had forgotten the most important thing of all. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the sound to sink into his very soul. Knowing that what he had just witnessed had changed him forever, Richard stood in the hallway, his chest rising and falling as though he had run a great distance, though he had only walked a few steps. What he had just seen unfolded in his heart with the weight of a revelation. For so long he had believed that the solution to every problem lay in his ability to provide, to pay, to build. When his wife had died, he poured himself into his work, convinced that the empire he built would protect Emily, shield her from every hardship. When Emily's illness worsened, he used his wealth like a sword, hiring the finest doctors, the most skilled therapists, the brightest minds money could afford. Each time he wrote a check, each time he signed a contract, he thought he was bringing her closer to happiness, closer to healing. But tonight, as he listened to the laughter spilling from her room, he realized how wrong he had been. Money had bought medicine, but it had not bought joy. It had bought treatment, but it had not bought laughter. It had built walls of security, but those same walls echoed with silence and loneliness. In his pursuit of giving Emily everything, he had forgotten the one thing she needed most, his presence. And yet Maria, a woman with no grand qualifications, no letters after her name, had given Emily in one evening what Richard had failed to give her in years. Not with expertise, not with wealth, but with love. The realization tore through him like lightning, searing his heart with both pain and clarity. Richard leaned against the wall, sliding one hand through his hair as the truth settled on him. He had measured his worth as a father by how much he could provide, not by how deeply he could connect. Every meeting he had prioritized over dinner, every late night at the office, every business trip he had justified as for her future, had cost him something priceless. He thought success meant security, but success had stolen the very moments that made security worthwhile. Watching Maria twirl and laugh with Emily showed him that joy had never been about resources, but about relationships. His daughter didn't need the world's best doctors every single day. She needed someone to hold her hands, to dance with her, to see her not as broken, but as whole in spirit. His mind flooded with guilt. memories rising like waves. He remembered the mornings when Emily would beg him to stay home just for a little while longer, but he always left, telling her that he had responsibilities, that everything he did was for her. He remembered the way her eyes would follow him as he rushed out the door, her small frame hunched in her chair, waving goodbye with a hand that trembled slightly. He remembered the countless times she waited for him to return, only to fall asleep in her chair because he came home too late to say goodnight. He had told himself she would understand one day, that she would thank him for all his sacrifices. But standing here now, listening to her laughter born not of his efforts, but of Maria's simple kindness, he realized he had been fooling himself, and yet, along with guilt, there was also something else. A quiet determination stirring in his soul. He could not change the past, could not erase the years he had spent trying to buy happiness, but he could change what came next. He could learn from what Maria had shown him, could step into his daughter's world instead of watching from the outside. He could laugh with her, even if awkwardly, even if imperfectly. He could offer her presents, not just provisions. For the first time in years, he understood what it meant to truly be a father. It wasn't about protecting her from every pain. It was about walking with her through it. Hand in hand, tears slid down his cheeks silently, but he didn't brush them away. They were cleansing tears, washing away the pride that had blinded him for so long. He thought of all the men like him, men who believed that success was measured in bank accounts and properties, when in truth, success was measured in the laughter of the people they loved, in the warmth of their presence, in the joy they could inspire simply by being there. He thought of how easy it was to forget this truth, how the world applauded achievements and wealth, but rarely spoke of the quiet victories of kindness, patience, and love. Maria's laughter with Emily was one of those victories, invisible to the outside world but powerful enough to shift the entire course of his heart. As Richard slowly moved away from the door, he felt lighter, though his shoulders still carried the weight of years of mistakes. He didn't yet know how to begin making things right, didn't know if Emily would welcome his new attempts to be closer, but he knew he had to try. He knew he could no longer hide behind his empire, no longer soothe himself with the illusion that money could heal everything. What mattered now was Emily's smile, her laughter, her spirit. What mattered was making sure she knew she was loved, not just cared for. And for the first time in a long time, Richard wanted to be the one to give her that love, not from a distance, not through others, but with his own heart. Maria had come into their lives quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Richard had hired her because the house felt too large, too demanding, and he needed someone to manage the small details while he buried himself in work. She wasn't extraordinary on paper. No prestigious references, no formal education beyond the basics, no polished presence that one might expect in a grand mansion like his. But there had been something in her eyes when she interviewed for the job, something soft yet steady, as if she carried within her an understanding of life that didn't come from books or certificates. Richard hadn't paid much attention to it then. To him, she was simply another employee, someone to maintain order in the house, nothing more. Yet now, as he stood remembering the laughter he had witnessed, he realized that Maria was far more than that. Her kindness was not loud or dramatic. It was in the way she noticed things others overlooked. The way Emily's blanket slipped from her lap when she sat in her wheelchair. The way her hands sometimes trembled when she tried to hold a cup. The way her eyes dimmed when silence filled the room too long. Maria never rushed, never made Emily feel like a task on a checklist. Instead, she moved with patience, with a gentleness that said, "You matter, I see you." And it was that very gentleness that had drawn Emily out of her shell, that had brought back the spark her father thought he would never see again. Maria didn't come with exercises or treatment plans. She came with stories. At first, Richard found it strange that Emily would beg Maria to sit with her instead of focusing on household duties. But Maria would tell her tales of her childhood, of her family, of simple joys like running through fields after the rain or baking bread with her grandmother. Emily listened with wide eyes, laughing at Maria's exaggerations, asking endless questions. Slowly, those stories grew into games. Maria would mimic characters, make silly faces, sing songs off key, and Emily, who had grown so used to silence, began to respond. At first with shy smiles, then with small giggles, and eventually with the full, unrestrained laughter Richard had heard upstairs. It wasn't skill or training that brought this transformation. It was the power of someone who cared deeply enough to see Emily as more than her illness. Richard thought back to how many experts had come and gone. They had brought charts, diagrams, careful plans designed to stimulate Emily's mind or strengthen her weak muscles. And while those visits had their place, none of them had touched Emily's spirit. They addressed her body but not her heart. Maria, without ever intending to, had reached a part of Emily that no one else could. She reminded Emily of what it felt like to be a child again, to play, to imagine, to be silly. She gave her the gift of being seen not as fragile or broken, but as whole, as capable of joy. That was something no paycheck, no diploma, no professional degree could provide. What struck Richard the most was that Maria never once asked for recognition. She never boasted about what she was doing, never pointed out how Emily had changed. She simply did what came naturally to her, filling the quiet moments with warmth, carrying laughter into rooms that had been empty for so long. She did not treat Emily as an obligation but as a friend, as someone worth spending time with. There was no pretense, no agenda. It was love in its purest form. Uncomplicated, selfless, and real. Richard began to notice small details he had once overlooked. He saw the way Maria would kneel beside Emily's chair so they could see each other eye to eye, leveling the world between them. He saw how she celebrated even the smallest victories, clapping her hands when Emily managed to lift something without trembling, cheering when she spoke with more strength in her voice. He saw how Maria's ladder often came first, pulling Emily into its rhythm until they were both laughing together, two voices blending into a harmony that healed the cracks of silence in the house. He saw the way Emily looked at her, not as an employee, but as someone who mattered deeply, someone she trusted completely. It humbled Richard to realize that all of his wealth, all of his connections, all of his status had not been able to give Emily what this young woman with no credentials had managed to offer. It was a lesson he had not expected, but one that struck him with undeniable clarity. Maria had taught him without even trying that healing doesn't always come from medicine or money. Sometimes it comes from laughter shared in a small room, from silly dances and whispered stories, from being present in a way that tells another soul you are not alone. The more he thought about it, the more Richard felt a deep sense of gratitude for Maria's presence. She had not only brought laughter back into Emily's life, but also into his own heart. Watching them together reminded him of what he had lost in his pursuit of success, of how far he had drifted from the simple joys that once defined his family. He realized that Maria's gift was not just her kindness, but her ability to remind others of what truly mattered. She wasn't trying to change the world. She was changing it quietly, one moment at a time, by giving her heart where it was needed most. And so, Richard began to see Maria differently. No longer just a maid. She became a teacher of sorts, not through words but through example. She showed him that love didn't need grand gestures, that joy could be found in the smallest acts, that healing could begin with something as simple as holding hands and laughing. It was a lesson he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The weeks that followed were filled with moments Richard never thought he would experience again. Each day carried with it both hope and challenge, small victories and painful setbacks. But within those struggles, he found himself growing closer to his daughter in ways he had once believed impossible. Emily's health was fragile, a reality that could not be ignored. Some mornings she woke with enough energy to smile, to laugh, to clap along to Maria's silly songs, and other mornings she was too weak to even lift her head. On those days, Richard would feel the old weight pressing against his chest, the same helplessness that had driven him into his work for so long. But this time, instead of retreating into the safety of his office or drowning himself in endless meetings, he chose to remain by her side. He sat quietly, holding her hand, learning that presence itself could be medicine. There were times when frustration filled the room. Emily, despite her gentle spirit, was still a child who longed to do the things her illness denied her. She wanted to run, to dance, to chase the sunlight outside, and when she could not, her tears came quickly. Richard, who had always been uncomfortable with emotions he could not fix, felt clumsy in those moments. He wanted to offer solutions, to promise her things he could not deliver, but Maria showed him a different way. She would kneel by Emily's chair, wipe her tears with the corner of her apron, and whisper, "It's okay to be sad, my little star, but when the sadness passes, the laughter will wait for you." Emily listened, and slowly she learned to release her frustration, to let it wash over her without letting it drown her spirit. Richard began to see the value of patience. He had built his life on speed, on efficiency, on solving problems as quickly as they appeared. But with Emily, there was no rushing, no shortcut, no deal to be made that could erase her pain. Every step was small, every bit of progress hard won, and every setback a reminder of how fragile she was. Yet in the midst of it all, he discovered that love had a pace of its own. Sometimes it meant sitting silently beside her for hours. Sometimes it meant laughing at something just to ease her disappointment. And sometimes it meant admitting that he didn't have the answers, but that he would never leave her side. Balancing work and family became another challenge he had to face. The business partners who had once admired him began to question his decisions. Meetings were postponed, deals delayed, and whispers spread through the boardroom that Richard was losing his focus. Some even accused him of weakness, suggesting he was sacrificing the empire he had built for the sake of personal distractions. Those words stung not because they were true, but because they reminded him of the man he used to be, the man who would have agreed with them without hesitation. Yet now, every time he looked at Emily's smile, he knew that no amount of money or power could ever outweigh the value of being present in her life. For the first time, he stood firm, choosing to let the business run without his constant control. Trusting others to manage what he had once clung to desperately, there were nights when exhaustion consumed him. Caring for Emily was not easy, and though Maria carried much of the daily responsibility, Richard insisted on taking part. He would stay awake when Emily had difficulty sleeping, humming lullabies he barely remembered from when she was a baby, his deep voice shaky but filled with love. He would feed her on days when her hands trembled too much to hold a spoon, guiding each bite patiently even as tears welled in his eyes at the sight of her struggle. And when she laughed, truly laughed, it renewed his strength in a way no amount of rest ever could. Those moments became his fuel, his reason to keep going despite the challenges. The bond between father and daughter grew stronger. Emily began to look at him differently, not as the distant figure who left each morning in a suit and returned too late to kiss her goodnight, but as a companion, a friend, someone who was finally there. She would reach for his hand more often, lean against him when she grew tired, and smile when he attempted to join in Maria's games, even if he looked ridiculous doing it. For Richard, those gestures were priceless treasures, proof that he was earning back what he had once lost. Still, there were moments of fear that reminded him of the fragility of their world. A sudden fever, a day of weakness that seemed worse than usual, a doctor's visit that brought no answers. Each of these moments threatened to shatter the fragile peace they had built. Richard felt his old instincts rise, the urge to throw money at the problem, to demand solutions, to push for immediate results. But he had learned enough by now to know that some things could not be forced. Instead of reacting with anger or panic, he chose to stay steady, to be the calm his daughter needed when her own fears overwhelmed her. Maria stood by his side, reminding him with her quiet strength that love was often the best medicine they had to offer through it all. Richard discovered parts of himself he had long buried. He found joy in the small rituals of daily life, sharing breakfast with Emily, reading her favorite stories aloud, watching the way her eyes lit up when she painted with shaky hands but steady determination. He found humility in asking Maria for guidance, admitting that he didn't always know what to do, but was willing to learn. And he found peace in the realization that success was not about the empire he had built, but about the love he could nurture within the walls of his home. The challenges never disappeared. They remained like shadows at the edge of every bright day. But Richard no longer saw them as obstacles meant to defeat him. Instead, he saw them as reminders of what truly mattered, opportunities to prove to his daughter that he would not abandon her when things became difficult. For every tear there was laughter, for every setback a moment of grace, and for every fear a reason to hold on tighter to the love that bound them together. Richard found himself waking up each day with a new sense of purpose, something he had not felt in years. The mansion that once stood like a museum of silence began to transform into a home filled with warmth. The hallways that had echoed only with the sound of his lonely footsteps now carried laughter, soft conversations, and the quiet hum of life returning. Richard no longer rushed to leave in the mornings. Instead, he lingered, sharing breakfast with Emily, sometimes cutting her food into small pieces, sometimes just listening as she spoke about the little things Maria had taught her. The man who once measured his days in meetings and deals began to measure them in smiles and moments of joy. It was a shift so profound that even he was astonished by how much peace it brought him. He began to look at the world differently. The cars in his garage, the rows of expensive suits in his closet, the awards displayed in glass cases, all of them felt less significant than the drawings Emily made with shaky hands or the sound of her laughter floating down the stairs. Success had a new definition now. It was not in the numbers his company reported at the end of each quarter, but in the light he saw in his daughter's eyes when she felt loved, valued, and alive. He understood that his legacy would not be measured by the empire he left behind, but by the love he gave to the child, who needed him more than anyone else ever could. Richard's priorities shifted so drastically that even his colleagues were forced to notice. Where once he had been the first to arrive at the office and the last to leave, now he came later, left earlier, and sometimes didn't appear at all. Meetings were rescheduled or delegated, and for the first time, he trusted others to carry the weight of responsibilities he had always shouldered alone. Some questioned his decisions, whispering that he had lost his edge, but Richard no longer cared for their approval. He had spent too many years chasing validation from the world while neglecting the validation that mattered most. The look of happiness on his daughter's face. The relationship between Richard and Emily grew richer with each passing day. She began to talk to him about her dreams, dreams that might never be fulfilled in the way most people imagined, but dreams nonetheless. She wanted to write stories about magical places where no one was ever too weak to dance, where children could fly and laugh without limits. Richard listened intently, promising to help her turn those dreams into something real. He bought her notebooks, colorful pens, and sat with her as she scribbled ideas, offering to be her scribe when her hands grew too tired. Together, they built worlds on paper, worlds that belonged only to them. In those moments, Richard wasn't a businessman or a provider. He was simply a father, and that role was more fulfilling than any other title he had ever carried. Maria continued to be a part of their journey, her presence weaving seamlessly into the fabric of their lives. Richard admired her more deeply with each passing day, not in a romantic sense, but with the reverence one feels toward someone who has given them a priceless gift. He watched how she guided Emily with patience, how she never allowed her to sink too deeply into despair, how she celebrated the smallest victories as though they were monumental achievements. Maria had become more than an employee. She was family, a sisterly figure to Emily, a teacher to Richard, and a steady reminder that love did not need grandeur to be powerful. She had shown him that sometimes the most extraordinary changes come from the simplest acts of kindness. Of course, there were still difficult days. Emily's condition did not vanish simply because laughter had returned. There were moments when she was too weak to sit up, when her breathing became labored, when fear hovered heavily in the room. But those moments no longer crushed Richard the way they once did. He faced them with strength he never knew he possessed, holding Emily close, whispering that she was never alone. Instead of retreating, he leaned in, and Emily, sensing his unwavering presence, drew courage from it. Together they weathered the storms, finding comfort not in certainty but in the bond that tied them together. Richard often reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the man he used to be, the man who believed that the measure of his love was in the things he could buy, the treatments he could afford, the empire he could build. That man had been blind, too consumed by ambition to see that the greatest treasures in his life required no money, only time and heart. He felt both sorrow and gratitude for the journey, sorrow for the years lost to pride and distance, gratitude for the chance to make things right while there was still time. It was not a perfect redemption, but it was real, and it filled him with peace. Evenings became his favorite time of day. The three of them, himself, Emily, and Maria, would often gather in Emily's room, the soft glow of lamps wrapping them in warmth. Sometimes they played games, sometimes they shared stories, sometimes they simply sat in silence, holding on to the quiet comfort of togetherness. On more than one occasion, Richard would hear Emily laugh and feel tears prick his eyes, not out of sadness, but out of overwhelming gratitude. That sound had become his anchor, his reminder of why he had changed, his proof that love, once forgotten, could be rediscovered. The mansion itself seemed to come alive with the shift. The once cold and echoing rooms now felt lived in, touched by warmth and meaning. The kitchen smelled of meals shared rather than hurried snacks. The living room echoed with conversations instead of silence, and Emily's bedroom became the heart of the house, glowing with the joy that radiated from within it. Richard realized that homes are not built by walls or wealth, but by the love that fills their spaces. And for the first time in years, he could walk through his own doors and feel at home. He often wondered how different life might have been if he had learned these lessons earlier. But he no longer allowed regret to poison the present. What mattered was now, this moment, this laughter, this bond. He had been given the chance to rediscover fatherhood, to choose presence over profit, to trade success in the world's eyes for significance in his daughters. And each time Emily reached for his hand, each time she smiled at him with that unshakable trust. He knew he had made the right choice,